This week, the 40th Annual Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, will convene in Washington, D.C. And I'm not going to lie to you, I wish that speaking at CPAC was the most important thing in my life right now. My mom's actually up in Washington, and I wish I was up there with her. But I have a lot more pressing concerns right now that demand my attention and my time. But I wanted to make a short video to put out there in time for CPAC 2013 so that people could watch it at CPAC or on their way to and from Washington or to and from the actual conference. And that's sort of just a collection of remarks. I've organized them into 3 separate parts, and so here goes. First, since Mitt Romney is going to be one of the speakers at CPAC, I wanted to start with what I thought was missing from his concession speech. Now, there really is no such thing as a good concession speech, not if it's your candidate who lost, because, well, he lost. And nothing he says is going to make up for the fact that he didn't win. But it would have been nice to have heard him say something like, "Our cause is right and just." Something along those lines. I hope that at CPAC he takes the opportunity to tell people, I know you're disappointed, and it's only natural to feel discouraged, but our cause is right and just. We know that more government does not necessarily mean more prosperity. We know that federal spending at current levels is unsustainable, and without big changes will inevitably lead to the collapse of our economy and a permanent loss of our status as the world's lone superpower. We know that entitlement reform is necessary to save the programs we hold dear from imminent bankruptcy. We know that if even a single dollar in the federal budget is wasted, then it makes no economic sense to raise taxes, ostensibly for the purpose of deficit reduction. We know that you don't stimulate the economy by taking more money out of the economy, that you don't create jobs by punishing job creators, and you don't encourage success by bailing out failures. Just because we lost this fight doesn't mean we're wrong. At most, it means that a majority of voters don't want what we're offering right now. But that's no reason to feel discouraged. The American electorate is far too dynamic to determine based on one election cycle what voters will want in the future. The America that elected Barack Obama is not the same as the America that elected Ronald Reagan. But the America that elected Ronald Reagan isn't the same as the America that elected FDR. Times change, people change, but the values on which our country was built and that continue to make it the last best hope for mankind endure. So I ask you tonight, keep up the fight. Never relent in your defense of liberty. Believe in yourself. Believe in our cause. Believe in America. You should have closed with "Believe in America." I mean, that was his campaign slogan, for God's sake. Well, believe in America, and then thank you, everybody. Good night. That's always how you do it. You thank your supporters, whether you won or lost. Well, that's about all for Romney. For part 2, I feel like some analysis of the election is appropriate, but we have to touch on the big elephant in the room. Much has been made of the disparity in voting preferences, especially in the last election, between white voters and non-white voters. Mitt Romney got nearly 60% of the white vote, higher than presidential candidate since Ronald Reagan. But Obama got 71% of the Latino vote and 93% of the black vote. So to win a national election in the future, conservatives need to make inroads among minority voters. Now, obviously this is a delicate issue, but here's what I'd say. I keep hearing conservatives say that Latino voters and a lot of African Americans are natural conservatives, that their personal views are more conducive to a conservative policy agenda than the left wing policy agenda. Survey after survey after survey shows, however, that while a majority of blacks and Latinos are socially conservative, or definitely not socially liberal, that they tend to be more liberal, more left wing on economic policy issues. So naturally, they would be voting Democrat if that trumps their social values, which it does for a lot of people. Certainly in the last election, when jobs and the economy were the major issues, that was a big factor in explaining why Obama did so well among non-white voters. So what can we do about that as conservatives? Well, one thing is we could just wait for the natural progression of things and just wait for enough of them to realize that these left-wing policies don't work. That's what turned a lot of people to the conservative side in the 60s and 70s, and then finally, came to a head in 1980, and then again in the 90s with the Republican Revolution. That's generally what keeps happening. Give people a chance to experience life under democratic left-wing economic policies, and they will inevitably conclude that they don't work. But because that might take too long, and there are a lot of pressing critical problems that need to be addressed, and that certainly won't be alleviated with left-wing policy agenda, we can offer these voters who aren't voting for conservative candidates solutions. We need to address the problems that matter to them. I'm not saying that all of them are amenable to the conservative agenda, but there's a lot of voters who voted for Obama in the last election, who vote Democratic, who may be more inclined to support a left-wing policy agenda, at least on domestic issues, who can be persuaded to support conservative policies. If the candidates running on a conservative policy agenda speak to the issues that matter to them. That's the most important thing. We have to address the issues that matter to voters to win their vote. It's just simple logic. There are dozens of examples in recent years of conservative candidates running and winning elections at the state and local level with significant support from minority voters, and then governing as conservatives and maintaining popularity. Now, if it can be done at the state and local level, then why can't it be done at the national level? I know it's easier to run a campaign for mayor or governor than it is to run a campaign for president, but the principle is the same. You speak to the issues that matter to voters. You have to address their concerns if you want to win their support. Now, if there's a voter, for example, whose concern is, I think that wealthy people have too much money, I want the government to provide me with health care. If I'm out of work, then I want the government to pay me until I feel like getting a job, and I really don't think that higher taxes on anybody has any effect on the economy, then we're probably not going to adequately address that voter's concern with conservative policies, just like Democrats can't adequately address the concerns of a small business owner who is really just trying to make ends meet and is suffering from too much regulation and excessive taxation and would just like the government to let up a little so that she could run her business the way that she knows it can succeed. That voter's concerns aren't going to be adequately addressed by left-wing policies. So we need to focus on the voters whose problems can be solved by conservative policies. Now, I will grant you that the left has the advantage of simplicity. Their pitch is simple and easy to explain and understand. We're going to take care of you. The government's going to provide for you. The government's going to take care of you and provide you with opportunity. That's a new buzzword they like to use. They'll couch it in terms of making investments in our future and ensuring that people are protected from those big, bad, greedy corporations who they blame for all the problems that they can. That brings me to another point. They have no problem lying to voters, and sometimes the lie sounds better than the truth. We tell the truth when making our case to voters, and the left attacks us. And sometimes low information voters will be convinced by their arguments because they're not limiting themselves to the truth or reality. The way we should deal with this problem is not to counter their lies with lies that make our arguments sound better, but to call them out on their mendacity. I run a website, rightwinggenius.com. So I say to you, go on MSNBC if you get the opportunity. Wouldn't it be gratifying to tell Chris Matthews or Rachel Maddow or that escaped mental patient with the creepy smile, "You're wrong, and here's why," to his face? If you get the chance, then go on NPR, go on The Daily Show or The Colbert Report, or Real Time. I mean, if you don't mind being sexually harassed by Bill Maher. None of the people who host these programs are very smart. Just make sure you have the facts straight and don't let them throw you off. Now, to tie this back to my original point about conservatives making inroads among minority voters, conservatives win elections when we address voters' concerns. We need to make sure that we're speaking to what matters to them, and that our message isn't being diluted by interference from the left-wing media or Organizing for America or any of these other forces dedicated to keeping the voters who they believe should be voting Democratic in the dark. And this brings me to my final point, the future of conservatism. Now, I said keeping voters who they naturally believe should be voting Democratic in the dark because the continued viability of the progressive movement in America and of the Democratic Party depends on keeping most of their base ignorant. A fundamental tenet of conservatism and an essential quality of a true conservative is acceptance of reality. Think about this in the context of the last election. If you understood what our $16 trillion rapidly increasing debt meant, if you understood that Social Security and Medicare could not survive in their current state and needed to be reformed, if you understood that we're never going to balance the federal budget without massive spending cuts and better economic growth, if you understood that the policies that Mitt Romney was proposing were not the policies that got us in this mess, if you understood that we're in the mess we're in because of Obama's policies, that should have been the most obvious. It still bothers me that so many people didn't understand that simple, obvious reality. But if you understood all of that, then you voted for Mitt Romney, and you understood the reality that it was either going to be Mitt Romney or Barack Obama winning the election. I mean, you may have understood all of that and still voted for Gary Johnson if you didn't accept that final reality that it was Romney or Obama. But if you didn't accept or understand any of that, then the fantasy world that Obama and the Democrats were campaigning on must have sounded pretty appealing. And conservative policy solutions don't always sound pleasant, but that's because sometimes reality is harsh and difficult problems don't always lend themselves to easy solutions. Some do. Sometimes even the easy solutions are hard for politicians who lack courage. Part and parcel to this acceptance of reality are the twin virtues of pragmatism and prudence. I don't want to get too grandiose and philosophical here, but as we evaluate how best to advance the conservative agenda, we must bear in mind that we do not have a conservative president in the White House. And so, We have a choice to make. Do we do what we did in the 90s and try and band together, work as a unit, and get the president to adopt as much of our conservative agenda as we possibly can? Or do we bide our time waiting for the day when we do have a conservative president, and in the meantime letting these critical problems that desperately need to be addressed get worse? The only other options are surrender or basically letting them divide us, and I don't find either of those to be acceptable. The most important thing to keep in mind is don't let them divide us. Save all the fight you have in you for fighting against them. Do not waste any time or energy fighting amongst yourselves. If you disagree with a fellow conservative, then don't attack that fellow conservative. Just let them go their own way. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say some proven conservative who's always been loyal to the cause decides to form a group, maybe a super PAC, with the express goal of boosting the candidate seen as the most electable in Republican primaries. And you think that's a fool's move, or an insult, or an attempt to manipulate the electoral process and undermine grassroots conservative efforts. Heresy! Whatever. Anyway, you don't have to attack the conservatives who do get involved with that effort. Just don't join up with them. Let them go their own way. You don't have to support that effort.
Hey, I didn't like the way this part of the video turned out, so let me just give you the gist of what I was saying. Infighting is always counterproductive, except during the presidential primaries, in which case, as we saw with the Democrats in 2008, sometimes a long protracted primary fight can be very, very helpful to your party's cause in the long run. Okay, let's skip to the end.
So, Marco, Paul, Kelly, Scott, Bobby, Rand, I'll leave you all to think about that, and I'll close with that. Thank you all. Knock it off. Okay. Well, that's about all I had. That's what I would say at CPAC anyway. So, if you like what you see, then make sure to pass it along, share it with others, subscribe. Oh, and please check out our blog, rightwinggenius.blogspot.com, and follow us on Twitter, @rightwinggenius. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't mess with the right-wing genius.